Yunus Karim. Minister, thank you for joining us. It's good to have you on the program.
Good morning.
Minister, let's start off this interview by getting government's perspective.
Well, we've been utterly clear for quite some time that the cost to communicate is far too high. Repeatedly, global investors tell us that one of the reasons, at least, that they do not want to invest in our country is the cost to communication is far too high, and certainly by the standards of other developing countries of a similar economic size and population size. Even domestic investors say that, in fact, the costs are far too high.
Yeah.
We rank very low on all the indexes that world bodies that attend to this matter produce. And in fact, we have in the ANC's manifesto for the 2014-29 period of government called on the government to ensure that the cost to communicate are reduced. Indeed, even the operators, the two major operators at least, MTN and Vodacom, agree that the cost to communicate has to come down. It has to come down not just in the interests of the poor and the disadvantaged, but in the interest of the economy as a whole, not least other sectors of business outside of the mobile industry.
Yeah. If we have to compare ourselves to other countries, I mean, just one country like the UK coming to mind, I mean, do they not, they don't even have call termination rates. Is that correct? I mean, is it something that some countries have even done away with?
Well, yes, the EU is edging towards doing away with it altogether.
Yeah.
So if you're in one country, let's say France, and you were to ring somebody, say in Germany, you would pay the same rates as you would if the person you're phoning is actually in France itself.
Yeah,
It's beginning to wane, beginning to fade out, and not just in the EU. I think you're going to find in other countries too. The very same companies that are involved here in South Africa are involved, of course, elsewhere on the continent and elsewhere too. And by comparison, using criteria that are indeed comparable, they charge far less in other countries than they do here. And they themselves have admitted, of course, that the cost to communicate is too high. We have to reduce these what you call interconnect rates or mobile termination rates as a means of ensuring that the cost to the retailer out there, the consumer out there, the citizen out there, the economy comes down.
Do you think that the 20-cent rate that ICASA is proposing is justifiable from the 1st of April?
Well, obviously, as the ministry, we don't have a say on that matter. ICASA is an independent regulator. It decides for itself. We don't interfere. At most, what we do as ministry is provide a policy directive on what we think is the broad direction ICASA might want to take. And in that regard, we would say, for example, that, look, the cost of communication is too high. You engage with the relevant stakeholders and decide on what is an appropriate cost to communicate, or in this case, interconnect rate as a basis for reducing the cost to the consumer.
Yeah.
We don't prescribe a figure, nor can we actually do much about that. But in broad terms, what ICASA is doing is certainly in the direction of what government wants to see and the economy as a whole wants to see. Okay. As for whether 20 cents is the precise figure, we in fact cannot comment except to say that in general that is the sort of direction we think they should take. And remember, of course, that the two major mobile operators, MTN and Vodacom, have for some 15 years or more received asymmetry, if you like, where they paid far less to Telkom for calls that Telkom received from their networks than Telkom paid for them in reverse. In fact, Telkom says it cost them some 50 billion rands of subsidies, if you like, to bolster MTN and Vodacom's growth, especially in the initial period of their entry into the market. So it's not as if they weren't beneficiaries of asymmetry, as it were. So why can't they also create space for smaller operators to benefit in some measure in terms of this asymmetry, where those small operators pay them less for calls being received on that's MTN and Vodacom's network, than the other way around.
Yeah. Let's talk about...
How else are you going to get competition? How else are you going to get a reduction in the cost to communicate?
Yeah.
All of us want it. You need the parliamentary committee, may I add, Leanne.
Yeah.
The one thing that unites them is this. They all said that what ICASA had decided was most welcome. In fact, it's opposition members that suggested there's greed here and so on. And may I stress, it's not as if we want to recklessly ruin or debilitate these mobile operators. One of them is particularly challenged, but we're trying to find, for our side as government, we can't prescribe to ICASA, a balance between the needs and interests of the mobile operators to secure an adequate rate of return on investment, to be able to reinvest in infrastructure and roll out, in particularly to underserviced and unserviced areas, and on the other hand, ensure that actually the consumers and the economy benefits too.
Yeah, Minister, let's talk about MTN and Vodacom's case now. They are, to quote them, saying that to charge lower cellular termination rates is irrational, it's unfair on them, we're moving their profits to smaller players, and they are saying that they may just move their investments out of the country, threatening things like that. You know, how does that make you feel as the ministry?
Well, obviously, not just us as a ministry, the government as a whole, the economy must be concerned about that. And what we're saying is that while on the one hand that threat is unnecessary, and similar threats, of course, were issued on the eve of the last set of draft regulations in 2010, those threats are almost inevitable. We also think, on the other hand, that to the extent that some or other measure might be taken in that regard, it's regrettable. In other words, we think it's quite possible for them, even with the current termination rates and asymmetry, as it were, to secure an adequate rate of return on the investment. For example, in the 2011-2012 financial year, or was it the 2012-2013 financial year? It escapes me now. Vodacom was able to give back to their shareholders some 10 billion rands and MTN 15 billion rands. So it's not as if they're going to be severely debilitated by this. And what we're saying to them, all of these mobile operators, not least the smaller ones, is they have to consider sharing of infrastructure, pooling their resources. Instead of all of them investing in their own fiber optic, is to cooperate at the level of infrastructure so that they save on their capital. They're not under pressure to secure an adequate rate of return on their respective investments in infrastructure, and that where the competition is to occur is more at the level of services. In fact, this is what we're saying in South Africa Connect, our broadband policy and strategy, that we want the public and private sectors to share their infrastructure and their fiber optic, and that it's at the level of competition that services have to, at the level of services indeed, that competition has to occur. Mind you, this is beginning to happen in Europe too. We cannot continue to duplicate.
Okay.
It's a waste of resources. It will benefit those companies, it will benefit the country and the consumer if they had a pooling of resources and a sharing of infrastructure. And of course, it will make the lives of municipalities easier, that there's not constant digging up of civil works and permission for way leaves and the like. In any case, that's what's beginning to happen elsewhere in the developed world, certainly.
Yeah. Minister, thank you. Thank you very much for talking to us here on Morning Live, and for government's perspective on this case. Of course, that is still ongoing. MTN and Vodacom in court talking about termination rates. Eunice Karim, the Minister of Communications, joining us from our Pretoria studios. All right, it was 25 minutes past.